Welcome to Calvary Cemetery in the Woodside and Maspeth neighborhoods of Queens, New York. With roughly 3 million burials, this is the most populated cemetery in the United States. More people rest here than live in some American cities. Established in 1848 by the Archdiocese of New York, Calvary stretches across 365 acres, divided into 4 great sections, each named after ancient Roman catacombs. The Manhattan skyline rises beyond its western edge, and the hum of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway is a constant companion. But for all that urban bustle, there are stories among these headstones that can stop you in your tracks. Singers and senators, detectives and mobsters, immigrants and athletes, they all ended up here in this vast Catholic city of the dead. Over the next hour, we'll visit 60 of them. Let's begin our walk. Our first stop brings us to the newest celebrity addition to Calvary, and one of the biggest names in American music. Tony Bennett, born Anthony Dominic Benedetto right here in Queens, rests in a family plot in 4th Calvary, Section 67. For decades, Bennett was the gold standard of American popular song, the man who could walk onto any stage in the world and own it with nothing more than his voice and a microphone. His signature recording, I Left My Heart in San Francisco, became one of the most recognizable songs of the 20th century after its release in 1962. But Bennett's career was never defined by a single hit. His first #1 song, Because of You, came in 1951, and he was still charting records more than 60 years later. He earned 20 Grammy Awards across that extraordinary span. What many people don't realize is that before he was a singer, Bennett was a soldier. He served as an infantryman in the European theater during the final stages of World War II, and was among the American troops who helped liberate a subcamp of Dachau. He rarely spoke about what he saw there, but it shaped him profoundly and made him a committed pacifist for the rest of his life. After the war, he studied at the American Theater Wing on the GI. Billin started performing under his birth name before Bob Hope, who had caught his act, suggested he change it. Anthony Benedetto became Tony Bennett. His career had its valleys. By the late 1970s, Bennett was considered a relic of an earlier era, out of step with the times. But rather than reinventing himself, he simply waited for the culture to come back around. And it did. A new generation discovered him in the 1990s, and his MTV Unplugged album won the Grammy for Album of the Year in 1995. In 2014, at 88, his duets album with Lady Gaga debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, making him the oldest artist ever to reach that spot. He was also an accomplished painter, whose work was exhibited in major galleries. In 2016, Bennett was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Though he continued performing for several more years, the music seemingly locked in a part of the brain the disease couldn't reach. He passed away on July 21, 2023, 2 weeks before what would have been his 97th birthday. He was laid to rest here beneath the family's modest Benedetto headstone, alongside his parents and grandmother. No stage name, no fanfare, just a Queens boy come home. Let's cross the grounds now to a very different kind of New York legend. In 3rd Calvary, Section 22, stands one of the most visited monuments in this entire cemetery, the grave of Joseph Petrosino, the most famous police detective of early 20th century New York. Petrosino was born in a small town near Salerno, Italy, in 1860, and immigrated to America as a boy. He joined the NYPD in 1883, and at just 5 feet 3 inches, he needed a special waiver to meet the department's height requirement. What he lacked in stature, he more than made up for in cunning and courage. Fluent in multiple Italian dialects, Petrosino became the department's go-to man for solving crimes in the Italian community. He was a master of disguise, donning fake mustaches and working-class clothes to blend in during undercover operations. His superiors, when a difficult case arose in the Italian neighborhoods, would simply call out, "Send for the Dago," a phrase that reflected both the prejudices of the era and the genuine respect Petrosino had earned. He caught the eye of Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, who personally promoted him. By 1908, Petrosino was a lieutenant heading the elite Italian squad, a unit of Italian-American detectives created specifically to combat the Black Hand, the extortion rackets that preyed on immigrant families through bombings and threats. In early 1909, Petrosino traveled secretly to Sicily to gather intelligence on criminals who had immigrated to America. It should have been a covert mission, but a newspaper leaked the story, and Petrosino found himself exposed and alone in enemy territory. On March 12, 1909, he was shot dead in the Piazza Marina in Palermo. He was 48 years old, and he left behind a wife and an infant daughter. His body was returned to New York aboard a steamship, and on April 12th of that year, more than 200,000 people lined the funeral route from Old St. Patrick's Cathedral to this cemetery. The New York Times wrote that if Petrosino had died a president, no deeper show of feeling could have been manifested. The city declared a holiday so its citizens could pay their respects. It remains one of the largest funerals in New York history. And here's the dark irony. Several of the very mobsters Petrosino spent his career pursuing ended up buried right here in Calvary alongside him. Speaking of which, let's visit one of those mobsters now. Not far from where Petrosino rests, in 1st Calvary, you'll find the grave of Joe Masseria, known in underworld circles as Joe the Boss. Masseria was one of the most powerful mafia figures in New York during the late 1920s and early 1930s, a heavy-set, bulletproof vest-wearing crime lord who controlled a vast criminal empire that included bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion rackets across Lower Manhattan and beyond. He was born in Sicily around 1879, immigrated to New York at the turn of the century, and rose through the ranks of the Italian underworld with a combination of ruthlessness and survival instinct that earned him his formidable nickname. Masseria was a central figure in what historians call the Castellamarese War, a vicious power struggle between rival Italian-American factions that erupted in 1929 and lasted nearly 2 years. On one side stood Masseria and his allies. On the other, Salvatore Maranzano and a coalition of rivals. Dozens of gangsters were killed in the conflict. The war ended not on a battlefield, but over a restaurant table. On April 15, 1931, Masseria accepted an invitation to lunch at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. He was joined by his lieutenant, Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man he trusted most. After a leisurely meal of pasta and lobster, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. In the moments that followed, gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Masseria dead. The boss reportedly died clutching the ace of spades, though that detail may well be embellishment added by colorful newspaper reporters. What's beyond dispute is that Luciano had orchestrated the entire thing. With Masseria gone, Luciano moved quickly to restructure the American mafia into the organized, corporate-style entity that would persist for decades. The five-family system, the commission, the whole apparatus. Masseria was about 52 when he died. He ended up here at Calvary, sharing the same consecrated ground as the detective who dedicated his life to fighting men just like him. The irony hangs over this cemetery like the smell of concrete after a summer rain. Let's leave the underworld behind for a moment and turn to something brighter. Heading into 2nd Calvary, we come to the resting place of one of America's most beloved comedians, Dom DeLuise. If you grew up watching movies in the 1970s and 80s, you know that round face, that warm laugh, that ability to make everyone around him crack up. Born Dominic DeLuise in Brooklyn in 1933, the youngest of 3 children, he grew up in an Italian-American household, which, as he'd tell you himself, was the best possible training for a life in comedy and cooking. He studied at Manhattan's High School of Performing Arts and later attended Tufts University as a biology major, but thankfully for us, he chose the stage instead. DeLuise's early career was a slow build. His first steady work was as an intern at the Cleveland Playhouse, and in 1961 he appeared in an off-Broadway musical alongside a 19-year-old Barbra Streisand. It lasted 1 performance. His big break came in 1966 with a scene-stealing supporting role in the Doris Day comedy The Glass Bottom Boat. The New York Times panned the film but singled DeLuise out as the best thing in it. From there, he became a fixture in the films of Mel Brooks, lighting up Blazing Saddles, History of the World Part 1, and Silent Movie. He was equally inseparable from his lifelong best friend Burt Reynolds, co-starring in the Cannonball Run, Smokey and the Bandit 2, and The End. On television, his manic Dominic the Great magic routine on The Dean Martin Show became a recurring highlight, a riotous bit in which every trick went spectacularly wrong. Brooks once said that every time he made a movie with DeLuise, he had to add 2 extra days to the shooting schedule just for laughter. Beyond live action, DeLuise had a wonderful second career voicing characters in animated films. He was Tiger in Don Bluth's An American Tail, Itchy in All Dogs Go to Heaven, and Fagin in Disney's Oliver and Company. He was also a genuinely accomplished cook who published several best-selling Italian cookbooks. DeLuise died of kidney failure on May 4, 2009, at 75, after battling cancer. When Reynolds heard the news, he said, "Dom always made you feel better when he was around, and there will never be another like him." Mel Brooks added, "It's hard to think of this life and this world without him." DeLuise rests here in a family plot, beneath the busy overpass of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Not the quietest spot, but somehow fitting for a man who was never quiet in life. From comedy, let us step back in time about 170 years. Somewhere in this vast cemetery, and the exact location is unknown, lie the remains of Lorenzo da Ponte, the man who wrote the words to 3 of Mozart's greatest operas. Born Emanuele Conegliano in Venice in 1749, he was Jewish by birth. When his widowed father converted the family to Catholicism in order to marry a Catholic woman, the 14-year-old boy took the name of the bishop who baptized him. Da Ponte was eventually ordained a priest, but scandal followed him relentlessly. A mistress, gambling debts, and public doubts about Catholic doctrine led to his exile from Venice. He landed in Vienna, where he became court poet to Emperor Joseph II, and entered into his legendary collaboration with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Together, they created The Marriage of Figaro in 1786, Don Giovanni in 1787, and Così fan tutte in 1790, 3 operas that remain cornerstones of the repertoire more than 2 centuries later. When the emperor died and Da Ponte lost his patron, he drifted to London, declared bankruptcy, and fled across the Atlantic. In America, he ran a grocery store in Pennsylvania, taught Italian lessons, opened a bookstore, and eventually became the first professor of Italian literature at Columbia University. He helped stage the first New York performance of Don Giovanni in 1825, and even founded an opera house at the age of 84, though it went broke after 2 seasons. Da Ponte died in 1838 at the extraordinary age of 89. Thousands attended his funeral at Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. He was originally buried in a Manhattan cemetery that was later paved over, and when remains were transferred here in 1909, the individual graves were no longer distinguishable. A memorial marker at Calvary honors his memory. It's a peculiar fate for the man who gave voice to Don Giovanni, his exact resting place lost to the ages, just as the Don himself vanishes into the flames. From the world of opera to the diamond, Calvary is home to not 1 but 2 Baseball Hall of Famers, and we'll start with the more colorful of the pair. Willie Keeler, known to all as Wee Willie, was one of the greatest contact hitters the game has ever produced. Standing just 5 feet 4 and weighing about 140 pounds, he used a bat only 30 inches long and choked up so far that one teammate said he only used half his bat. His philosophy was immortalized in a single line every baseball fan knows: keep your eye clear and hit 'em where they ain't. And hit them he did. Keeler batted over .300 in 16 of his 19 big league seasons. In 1897, he hit .424, still the highest single-season average ever for a left-handed hitter, and started the year with a 44-game hitting streak, a record that stood for 44 years until Joe DiMaggio broke it in 1941. He was so nearly impossible to strike out that he averaged just 1 strikeout for every 63 at-bats, the best ratio in Major League history. In one season with Brooklyn, he struck out only twice in 570 at-bats. He was also the impetus for a rule change. He was so skilled at fouling off pitches with bunt attempts that the rules were changed to make a foul bunt with 2 strikes a strikeout. Keeler played for the Baltimore Orioles, the Brooklyn Super Bays, and the New York Highlanders, the team that would later become the Yankees. He was the son of Irish immigrants from County Cork, and Brooklyn was his home from beginning to end. He never married. By the time he died on New Year's Day, 1923, from heart disease at 50, he had lost much of his savings. His funeral was attended by many old teammates and some of the biggest names in early baseball. At his own request, he was buried in his mother's grave here at Calvary. A short walk from Keeler, we find the second Hall of Famer, Mickey Welch, whose full name was Michael Francis Welch. Nicknamed Smiling Mickey for his perpetually cheerful disposition, the man genuinely seemed to enjoy being on a pitcher's mound more than anywhere else on earth. Welch was a right-handed pitcher who spent the bulk of his career with the New York Giants. Between 1880 and 1892, he won 307 games, a total that places him in extremely elite company in baseball history. Only a handful of pitchers have ever reached that mark. Welch was one of the game's earliest craftsmen. While many pitchers of his era relied on sheer velocity, Welch was a master of changing speeds and movement, keeping batters off balance with a curveball that his contemporaries considered among the best in the game. He's credited as the first pitcher ever used as a pinch hitter, called upon to swing the bat in a situation where his manager needed offense rather than defense, a testament to his all-around ability. In 1884, he struck out the first 9 batters he faced in a game, setting a record that stood for decades. After hanging up his glove, Welch stayed near the game he loved. He worked as a gatekeeper at the Polo Grounds, the very ballpark where he had once dominated opposing lineups, and later held a job with a city agency. There's something poignant about that. A man who had once been one of the most famous athletes in New York, punching a clock at the stadium gate and watching younger men play the game he'd mastered. Welch lived to be 82, dying quietly in 1941, and was elected to the Hall of Fame posthumously in 1973 by the Veterans Committee. 2 Hall of Famers from baseball's earliest chapters, resting within walking distance of each other in a Queens cemetery. It's the kind of thing that makes a cemetery walk more rewarding than you'd expect. Now let's turn from sports to politics, and to one of the biggest political stories in American history. Near Section 45, you'll find the grave of Alfred E. Smith, the 4-time governor of New York and the first Roman Catholic ever nominated for president by a major political party. Smith grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the son of an Irish-American mother and an Italian-American father whose real surname was Ferraro. He never finished high school. He liked to say he received his education at the Fulton Fish Market, where he worked as a teenager after his father died. Despite that lack of formal schooling, Smith became one of the shrewdest politicians of his generation. He rose through the ranks of Tammany Hall, served in the state assembly, where the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 made a deep impression on him, and was elected governor in 1918, the first Irish American to hold that office. He won 3 more terms, pushing reforms in labor protections, factory safety, and women's rights, working closely with Francis Perkins, who would later become FDR's Secretary of Labor. In 1928, Smith won the Democratic nomination for president, but his Catholicism became the defining issue of the campaign. Anti-Catholic sentiment ran deep. There were whispers that the Pope would move to Washington if Smith won, and he lost decisively to Herbert Hoover. The defeat stung, and Smith's relationship with his protege, Franklin D. Roosevelt, soured bitterly. When Roosevelt won the presidency and launched the New Deal, Smith saw it as a betrayal of sound government and joined the conservative American Liberty League in opposition. His later years were spent as president of the company that built and managed the Empire State Building, a connection between Smith and that iconic skyscraper that most people don't know about. Smith died of a heart attack on October 4, 1944, at 70, just 5 months after losing his wife to cancer. The song "The Sidewalks of New York" was his campaign anthem, And the man who wrote those lyrics, as we'll see later, is buried here at Calvary too. Smith isn't the only political heavyweight in this section. Nearby rest 3 generations of the Wagner family, a dynasty that shaped New York across much of the 20th century. Robert F. Wagner was born in Germany in 1877 and immigrated to New York as a child, growing up in the tenements of Yorkville on the Upper East Side. He became a lawyer, entered politics, and served as a United States Senator from New York from 1927 to 1949. During that time, he authored some of the most consequential labor legislation in American history, including the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, commonly known as the Wagner Act, which guaranteed workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. It was a transformative law that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between labor and management in this country. Wagner also co-sponsored the Social Security Act, putting him at the center of the New Deal's most lasting achievements. His son, Robert F. Wagner Jr., followed him into public service and was elected the 102nd mayor of New York City, serving 3 terms from 1954 to 1965. The younger Wagner oversaw a period of enormous growth and change, including major public housing construction and the beginning of the Civil Rights era in New York. And Robert Wagner III, the mayor's son, served as president of the New York City Board of Education and deputy mayor before his death in 1993 at just 49. 3 generations of public servants, senator, mayor, and civic leader, all resting in the same corner of this cemetery. From public servants to the public's darling, let's visit an entertainer whose fame burned bright and fast. Texas Guinan, born Mary Louise Cecilia Guinan in Waco, Texas in 1884, was the undisputed queen of New York's speakeasy scene during Prohibition. Before she became a nightclub legend, she'd already lived several lives: convent schoolgirl in Waco, scholarship student at a conservatory in Chicago, vaudeville singer, silent movie cowgirl who starred in westerns with titles like The Gunwoman and The She-Wolf, and even a film producer who ran her own production company. But it was as the hostess of a series of wildly popular speakeasy clubs in the 1920s that she became a national sensation. Her trademark greeting to every customer who walked through the door was a cheerful shout, "Hello, sucker!" Her clubs, particularly the 300 Club on West 54th Street, attracted the rich and famous of the era. George Gershwin would play impromptu piano sets, and regulars included Jack Dempsey, Al Jolson, Rudolph Valentino, and the Prince of Wales. Guinan was arrested multiple times for violating prohibition laws, but she was always acquitted, invariably claiming that her patrons had brought their own liquor and that the girls danced so close to the customers only because the club was small. She had a talent for turning every setback into publicity. When she tried to take her show to Europe, she was denied entry at every port, turned away in France, England, everywhere. She simply renamed her revue Too Hot for Paris and brought it back to packed American houses. Texas Guinan contracted amoebic dysentery while touring in Vancouver and died there on November 5, 1933. She was 49. Prohibition was repealed exactly 1 month later. She missed the party by 30 days. 12,000 people viewed her body at a Broadway funeral home before she was buried here. The character of Guinan, the bartender played by Whoopi Goldberg on Star Trek: The Next Generation, was named in her honor. From the roar of the 20s to the quieter heroism of an immigrant girl. In Section 20, marked by a Celtic cross of Irish blue limestone, lies Annie Moore, the very first immigrant to be processed through Ellis Island. On New Year's Day, 1892, Annie, just 17 years old, stepped off the steamship Nevada, having traveled in steerage from County Cork with her 2 younger brothers, Anthony and Philip, to rejoin their parents in Manhattan. The trio had endured a 12-day Atlantic crossing. Annie's brothers reportedly pushed her to the front of the gangplank with the help of a man who hollered, "Ladies first!" An official from the Treasury Department presented her with a $10 gold piece to mark the occasion. The New York Times described her as a little rosy-cheeked Irish girl. Over the following 6 decades, more than 12 million immigrants would follow Annie through that gateway. Her own life after that shining moment was far less celebrated. She married Joseph Scheer, the son of German immigrants who worked at Manhattan's Fulton Fish Market. They had 11 children, 5 of whom died before reaching their first birthday. Annie spent her entire adult life in the tenements of the Lower East Side, never far from where her parents had first settled. She died of heart failure in 1924 at the age of 50. For more than 80 years, her grave here was unmarked, likely because the family couldn't afford a stone. It wasn't until 2006 that genealogist Megan Smolenyak identified the plot, and in 2008, descendants and the Irish-American community unveiled the Celtic cross that now marks her resting place. Statues of Annie stand at both Ellis Island and Cove, the Irish port from which she sailed. She represents millions, but her own hardscrabble life is a reminder that arriving in America was only the beginning of the story. Moving across to 2nd Calvary, we come to one of the more fascinating transformations in American entertainment. Tony Sirico, Paulie Walnuts himself. If you watch The Sopranos, you remember that silver-winged hair, that perpetual scowl, that unmistakable voice. Sirico played Paulie Walnuts Gualtieri for the entire run of HBO's landmark drama, creating one of television's most beloved and quotable characters. The superstitious, tracksuit-wearing, oddly lovable enforcer who provided much of the show's dark humor. What made the performance so unforgettable was that Sirico wasn't entirely acting. Born Gennaro Anthony Sirico Jr. in Brooklyn in 1942, he grew up in the Bensonhurst and East Flatbush neighborhoods and was arrested 28 times before he ever stood on a stage for disorderly conduct, assault, robbery, and weapons possession. As a teenager, he was shot during a dispute. He served in the United States Army and then returned to a life that kept him in and out of jail. It was during his last stretch in prison, at Sing Sing, that an acting troupe of former convicts visited the facility, and something shifted inside him. After his release, Sirico committed to a new path. He started with small roles, often playing mobsters, a typecasting he embraced rather than resented. He appeared in Goodfellas, Copland, and 7 Woody Allen films, building a reputation as a reliable character actor with genuine menace and unexpected humor. When David Chase was casting The Sopranos, Sirico auditioned for the role of Uncle Junior, but Chase saw something else in him and steered him toward Paulie instead. It was the role of a lifetime, and Sirico brought a condition of his own. Paulie would never become an informant. That was the one thing the real Tony Sirico refused to play. He also voiced Vinny the dog on Family Guy and Big Daddy on The Fairly Odd Parents. Sirico died on July 8, 2022, at 79, at an assisted living facility in Fort Lauderdale after a period of declining health and dementia. His brother, Father Robert Sirico, a Catholic priest and co-founder of the Acton Institute, celebrated the funeral mass at the Basilica of Regina Paz's in Brooklyn. From one figure of the Italian-American experience to another, though this one is considerably older. In the older sections of 1st Calvary, you'll find the resting place of Patrick Gilmore, a man whose name you may not know, but whose influence you have certainly felt. Born in County Galway, Ireland in 1829, Gilmore immigrated to America as a young man and became, by common agreement, the father of the American concert band. Before John Philip Sousa, before any of the great marching and civilian bands that became an American institution, there was Gilmore. He organized and led massive musical festivals, spectacles of a scale nobody had attempted, including the 1869 National Peace Jubilee in Boston, which featured an orchestra of 1,000 musicians, a chorus of 10,000 singers, and even cannon fire timed to the music. During the Civil War, Gilmore led the band of the 24th Massachusetts Infantry, and is sometimes credited with writing "When Johnny Comes Marching Home," though the exact authorship remains debated. The song was published under the pseudonym Louis Lambert. After the war, he took over the famous 22nd Regiment Band of New York, transforming it into the premier concert band in the country. Gilmore died suddenly of a heart attack in 1892 at 63, while his band was performing at the St. Louis Exposition. He collapsed during the concert and was gone within hours. His legacy lived on in every marching band and concert band that followed. Let's step into the world of Tammany Hall for a moment. Charles Francis Murphy, who lies here at Calvary, was the boss of New York City's infamous Democratic political machine from 1902 until his death in 1924. Unlike the flamboyant bosses who preceded him, the cigar-chomping, glad-handing caricatures of political cartoons, Murphy was quiet, understated, and ruthlessly effective. He was sometimes called Silent Charlie because he rarely spoke in public and conducted most of his business from a reserved table at Delmonico's restaurant. But behind that silence was a political mind that shaped the careers of governors and mayors, including Al Smith, whom we visited earlier, and Robert Wagner, whom we just met. Murphy is a complicated figure. He was certainly corrupt, Tammany was Tammany, but he also moved the machine towards supporting progressive causes, including labor reform, factory safety legislation, and women's suffrage, understanding that the political future belonged to whoever served the needs of working-class immigrants. He was an Irish American who grew up on the East Side and worked at the gasworks before entering politics. He died of a heart attack in 1924 at the age of 66. 20,000 people attended his funeral. Political reform ultimately killed the machine he built, but Tammany's influence on New York lasted well beyond its demise. Not far from Murphy rests another Tammany man, perhaps the most quotable politician in New York history. George Washington Plunkett held a variety of political offices over his long career, including state senator and assemblyman. But he's remembered today almost entirely for a series of remarkably candid interviews he gave to newspaper reporter William Reardon, published as a book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. In those interviews, Plunkett laid out his philosophy of practical politics with breathtaking honesty. His most famous distinction was between what he called honest graft and dishonest graft. Dishonest graft, he explained, was stealing from the city treasury. Honest graft was simply using your insider knowledge to profit, buying up land where you knew a park was about to be built, for instance. "I seen my opportunities and I took 'em," he declared, in what may be the most perfectly New York sentence ever uttered. He once claimed to hold 4 public offices simultaneously, collecting a salary from each, and saw nothing wrong with it. The book remains a classic of American political literature, assigned in college courses to this day. Plunkett died in 1924 at 82. His grave here at Calvary is unmarked, which seems wrong for a man who had so much to say. The last of the Tammany bosses on our tour rests nearby. Carmine DeSapio holds the distinction of being the very last boss of Tammany Hall. DeSapio took control of the machine in 1949 and tried to modernize it, bringing in younger candidates and supporting reform-minded Democrats. He was the first Italian-American to lead Tammany, breaking the Irish stranglehold on the organization that had lasted since the mid-19th century. For a time in the 1950s, he was one of the most powerful political figures in New York, playing a key role in the election of Governor Averell Harriman and exerting influence over the courts, the city council, and the party apparatus. But by the late 1950s, a reform movement, led in part by Eleanor Roosevelt and a group of young activists who called themselves the Village Independent Democrats, targeted DeSapio and everything he represented. He was voted out of his district leadership in 1961, and Tammany Hall effectively died with his ouster. DeSapio was later convicted of bribery and conspiracy, and served time in federal prison. After his release, he lived quietly in Greenwich Village for decades, a ghost of a vanished era, dying in 2004 at the age of 95. He was the last of a breed. Let us shift from politics to poetry. Somewhere in these grounds rests Claude McKay, one of the most important writers of the Harlem Renaissance, and a man whose life was as restless and far-ranging as his verse. McKay was born in Sunnyville, Jamaica, in 1889, the youngest of 11 children in a farming family. He showed literary talent early, publishing 2 volumes of dialect poetry in Jamaica before he was 23. In 1912, he came to the United States to study agriculture, first at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and then at Kansas State. But the American heartland couldn't hold him. He abandoned his studies and moved to Harlem, where the explosive cultural energy of Black New York captured his imagination and his pen. McKay's early American work burned with fury at the racial injustice he witnessed firsthand. His 1919 poem, If We Must Die, was composed in the white heat of the Red Summer, a season of horrific racial violence, white mobs attacking black communities in city after city across the nation. The poem was a defiant call to resistance, urging black Americans to fight back rather than submit to slaughter. It transcended its immediate context almost immediately. Winston Churchill quoted it years later to rally British resolve during the darkest days of the Second World War, though Churchill almost certainly had no idea the poem had been written by a black Jamaican in a Harlem apartment, in response not to a foreign enemy but to American racial terror. McKay's 1928 novel, Home to Harlem, became the first best-selling novel by a black author, though it drew sharp criticism from Webb Du Bois, who felt the book pandered to white readers' voyeuristic fascination with the seedier aspects of black urban life. Langston Hughes, on the other hand, admired McKay's frankness and vitality. The disagreement reflected real tensions within the Harlem Renaissance itself about audience, representation, and purpose. McKay was constitutionally unable to stay in one place. He traveled to the Soviet Union in 1922, where he was received as a celebrity. He lived in France and Morocco for extended periods, writing prolifically wherever he went. But his political views evolved over the decades. Disillusioned with communism and searching for spiritual grounding, McKay converted to Roman Catholicism late in life, a turn that bewildered some of his friends and admirers. That conversion is why he rests here at Calvary, a Catholic cemetery, rather than in a Harlem burial ground. He died of heart failure in Chicago in 1948, at 58, far from both Jamaica and the neighborhood that inspired his greatest work. His poetry endures, fierce, musical, uncompromising. From a literary figure to a figure of literary legend, or at least legendary audacity, Steve Brodie, who rests here at Calvary, became one of the most famous New Yorkers of the 1880s by claiming to have jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge and survived. On July 23, 1886, Brodie, a 23-year-old bookmaker and Bowery saloon regular, allegedly leaped from the bridge into the East River below. The problem is, nobody actually saw him jump. Witnesses saw a man pulled from the water beneath the bridge, but whether Brodie really jumped or simply had a friend throw a dummy off the side while he swam out from the riverbank remains one of New York's great unsolved debates. What's not debatable is that Brodie made a small fortune from the stunt. He opened a successful saloon on the Bowery that became a tourist attraction, starred in a play about his supposed feat, and became a bona fide celebrity. His name entered the American language. To pull a Brodie meant to take a spectacular leap, whether literal or figurative. Even Bugs Bunny referenced him in a cartoon. Brodie died in 1901 at the age of 38 from complications of diabetes. Whether he actually jumped or not, the man knew how to make a splash and keep the debate going for 140 years. Let's move to a different section now and meet an actress whose work you have absolutely seen, even if you can't put a name to the face. Or more precisely, even if you can't put a name to the scream. Una O'Connor was born in Belfast, Ireland in 1880, and after a distinguished career on the London and Dublin stages, she was a member of the Abbey Theatre during its legendary early years under the direction of W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory. She moved to Hollywood in the early 1930s and became one of the most recognizable character actresses in all of classic cinema. If you've ever watched the 1935 version of The Bride of Frankenstein, you know her. She's the shrieking, hysterical maid whose screams of terror practically puncture the soundtrack. Her face, contorted in exaggerated horror, is one of the indelible images of old Hollywood. Director James Whale loved working with her and cast her repeatedly. In The Invisible Man, her terrified reactions to Claude Rains's invisible antics are half the entertainment of the picture. She screams, she gasps, she flails, and she somehow makes it both genuinely funny and oddly convincing. Whale understood that O'Connor had a rare gift. She could play hysteria at a pitch that would seem absurd from anyone else, but somehow worked perfectly because she committed to it so fully. O'Connor appeared in more than 50 films over 3 decades, almost always playing maids, landladies, nurses, or sharp-tongued working-class women with powerful opinions and even more powerful lungs. Her credits read like a greatest hits list of Golden Age Hollywood. David Copperfield, The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Informer, Witness for the Prosecution, The Bells of St. Mary. Yes, she had a particular talent for comic indignation, the kind of character who walks into a room, takes one look at the chaos, and lets everyone know exactly what she thinks about it. O'Connor retired to New York in her later years and died in 1959 at 78. She never won any major awards, but she enriched every film she appeared in, and classic movie fans recognize her instantly. Staying with the world of early Hollywood, let's visit Nancy Carroll, who rests in 3rd Calvary, and whose story is a cautionary tale about how fast fame can evaporate. In the very first years of talking pictures, when the entire film industry was reinventing itself overnight, Nancy Carroll was the biggest star in the world. Born Anne Veronica LaHiff in New York City in 1903, she was one of those New York girls who seemed destined for the stage. She started dancing in chorus lines as a teenager, graduated to leading roles on Broadway, and caught the eye of Paramount Pictures, which signed her to a contract and brought her west. Carroll made a seamless transition from silent films to talkies. Many stars of the silent era were destroyed by the arrival of sound. Their voices didn't match the images audiences had built in their heads, or they simply couldn't act with dialogue. Carroll had no such problems. Her voice was warm, natural, and expressive, and she could handle comedy and drama with equal skill. By 1930, she was the #1 box office draw in America, ranked higher than Greta Garbo, higher than Joan Crawford, higher than anyone. She earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress for her performance in The Devil's Holiday that same year. Fan magazines devoted cover after cover to her flaming red hair and vivacious personality. But Carroll had a stubborn streak that put her at odds with Paramount's executives. She clashed with the studio over the roles they assigned her, turning down parts she considered beneath her and demanding better material. In the rigid studio system of the 1930s, this was a battle an actress almost always lost. Paramount let her contract expire, and without the backing of a major studio, Carroll's career faded with startling speed. By the mid-1930s, she was making low-budget pictures for minor studios. By the end of the decade, she had essentially retired from the screen. She returned to the New York stage and later appeared in television dramas during the 1950s and early 60s, including episodes of some of the era's most prestigious anthology series. Carroll died of natural causes in 1965 at 62. She is one of those stars who remind us that the Hollywood machine could build you up to the highest heights and then simply move on, leaving you behind without a backward glance. From a forgotten star to a man who was never forgotten by fans of gritty New York cinema, Joe Spinell. Born Joseph Spagnuolo in Manhattan in 1936, Spinell was a character actor who appeared in some of the most important American films of the 1970s and 80s, usually in small but vivid roles that lingered in the memory long after the credits rolled. He was in both Godfather films, playing a minor associate of the Corleone family, and in both Rocky films, where he portrayed Tony Gazzo, the loan shark who employs Rocky as a debt collector. He appeared in Taxi Driver, playing a hotel clerk in one of Martin Scorsese's most unsettling scenes. He turned up in Sorcerer, in Cruising, in Nighthawks. Spinell had a remarkable ability to project menace, desperation, and a certain seedy intelligence, the kind of face you remember even when the character doesn't have a name. He was a recurring presence in Sylvester Stallone's early career, having befriended the actor before either of them was famous. Spinell loved the business, loved acting, and was known for being tireless in pursuing work and generous with his time on set. But his most lasting and controversial contribution to cinema came from a very different corner of the film world: the 1980 slasher film Maniac, in which Spinell starred as a psychotic serial killer stalking the streets of New York. He also co-wrote the screenplay. The film was reviled by mainstream critics upon its release, It's genuinely disturbing and does not flinch from violence. But over the decades, it has been reappraised as a cult classic and an influence on an entire generation of independent horror filmmakers. Spinell struggled with his weight and health throughout his life. On January 13, 1989, he was found dead in his New York apartment at the age of 52, having bled to death from a laceration. The manner of death was ruled accidental. Those who knew him remembered a man who loved movies with an almost childlike intensity and who never stopped working to get the next role. Now let us visit a story that belongs to the very dawn of cinema. Robert Harron, sometimes called Bobby Harron, was one of the biggest male stars in the earliest years of the movies, and he lies here in 2nd Calvary. Harron was born in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, in 1893, one of 9 children in an Irish-American family that lived modestly and needed every pair of hands to contribute. At the age of 13, Bobby started working as a messenger boy and errand runner at the Biograph Studios on East 14th Street, where the pioneering director D.W. Griffith was creating the grammar of cinema itself, inventing close-ups, cross-cutting, and the techniques that would become the foundation of movie storytelling. Griffith noticed the boy, saw something genuine and appealing in his face, and began putting him in front of the camera. Harron was a natural. He had no formal training, no theatrical background, just an instinctive ability to be real on screen, which was exactly what Griffith's new art form demanded. By his late teens, Harron was Griffith's leading man, starring in some of the director's most ambitious and important films. Intolerance, the sprawling multi-era epic that remains one of cinema's most audacious experiments, and Hearts of the World, a war drama filmed partly in the actual trenches of World War I France. Harron was handsome, sincere, and sympathetic. Audiences loved him, and critics praised his work as a harbinger of a more natural acting style. But the movie business is cruel to its favorites. As the decade turned, Griffith began favoring a new leading man, Richard Barthelmess, who had a different energy, a different look. Harron found himself pushed to the margins, given smaller roles in films where he had once been the star. On September 1, 1920, while staying at a New York hotel, reportedly in town for the premiere of a Griffith picture in which he appeared in a diminished role, Harron was found with a gunshot wound. He died 4 days later at the age of 27. The death was officially ruled accidental, with the explanation that Harron had been handling a pistol that discharged while he was unpacking his luggage. But many who knew him believed he had taken his own life, unable to bear the loss of his place in the spotlight. D.W. Griffith was grief-stricken. The truth of what happened in that hotel room has never been established with certainty. After that somber note, let's visit someone whose name you'll recognize if you've ever hummed along to one of New York's most enduring tunes. James W. Blake rests here at Calvary, and he wrote the lyrics to what might be the city's unofficial anthem, The Sidewalks of New York. You know it. East side, west side, all around the town, the tots sang Ring-a-Rosy. London Bridge is falling down. Blake penned those words in 1894 while working at a hat shop on Park Row, collaborating with composer Charles Lawler, whom he'd met in a saloon. The story goes that Lawler had a melody and needed words, and Blake, who dabbled in verse, scribbled out the lyrics in about 15 minutes. The song became an instant sensation, one of those melodies that seem to capture the spirit of a city in a few simple verses. It took on a second life decades later when Al Smith adopted it as his presidential campaign theme in 1928. A nice connection within these cemetery walls, since Smith, as you'll recall, is buried not far from here. Blake never produced another song to rival it. He was a hat salesman, not a professional songwriter, and songwriting remained his sideline throughout his life. He died in 1935 at 73 in modest circumstances. But that one song outlived him by generations and will likely be hummed in New York as long as there are sidewalks to walk on. Our next stop takes us to an Irish-born athlete who was once considered the greatest all-around sportsman in the world. Martin Sheridan was born in Bohola, County Mayo, Ireland, in 1881, one of 5 brothers who all emigrated to New York. He joined the New York City Police Department, as did several of his brothers. and became a member of the Irish American Athletic Club, a powerhouse organization that produced dozens of Olympic athletes in the early 20th century. Sheridan competed in 3 consecutive Olympic Games, 1904, 1906, and 1908, and won 5 gold medals, dominating the discus throw and also medaling in the shot put and other events. At the 1908 London Olympics, Sheridan was selected as the American flag bearer during the opening ceremony. According to a tradition that has become part of Olympic lore, when the American team passed the royal box, Sheridan refused to dip the flag in deference to King Edward VII. The story goes that he declared, "This flag dips to no earthly king," though whether those exact words were spoken is debated by historians. What is not debated is the result. The American flag has never been dipped at an Olympic ceremony since, making it unique among national delegations. Sheridan stood 6 feet 3 and weighed over 200 pounds, a physical giant in his era. Tuberculosis cut him down. He contracted the disease and died in 1918 at just 37, his decline likely accelerated by the great influenza pandemic sweeping the world that autumn. From an Olympic champion to a very different kind of public figure. Thomas Lucchese, known as Three-Finger Brown because a childhood accident with a machine had cost him a finger on his right hand, was one of the most powerful and longest-reigning mafia bosses in American history. Born Gaetano Lucchese in Palermo, Sicily in 1899, he immigrated to New York as a boy and grew up in East Harlem. He entered the world of organized crime as a young man and rose steadily through the ranks, demonstrating a patience and political acumen that set him apart from the hotheads and gunmen who populated the lower levels of the mob. Unlike many of his flashier contemporaries, Lucchese was a quiet, disciplined operator who avoided the spotlight with almost fanatical determination. He dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and conducted his business with an air of respectability that fooled no one in law enforcement, but made him difficult to prosecute. His organization's primary source of income came from the garment industry. Lucchese controlled the trucking that moved goods in and out of New York's vast garment district, giving him a stranglehold on one of the city's most important economic sectors. Anyone who wanted a rack of dresses to move from a factory on 7th Avenue to a department store in New Jersey needed Lucchese's trucks, and Lucchese's trucks didn't come cheap. He also cultivated deep political connections, particularly within the Democratic Party machine in New York. Law enforcement spent decades trying to build major cases against him, but Lucchese was careful, surrounded himself with layers of insulation, and never made the kind of public mistake that would give prosecutors an opening. He died of a brain tumor on July 13, 1967, at the age of 67, having led his family for more than a decade. His funeral here at Calvary drew a who's who of the underworld. The crime family he built outlived him and still carries his name to this day. And the detective who fought hardest against men like him, Joseph Petrosino, whom we visited at the beginning of our tour, lies just a few sections away. Let's lighten things up with a trip back to show business. Patsy Kelly was an actress and comedian whose career spanned more than 5 decades and took her from the vaudeville stages of the 1920s to the Hollywood sound stages of the 1970s, with plenty of drama in between. Born Bridget Veronica Kelly in Brooklyn in 1910, she was a natural performer from childhood, quick-witted, fearless, and possessed of a comic timing that seemed hardwired into her personality. She started performing in her teens, working in vaudeville revues and landing on Broadway before Hollywood came calling. In the 1930s, Kelly became one of Hal Roach's biggest comedy stars, making a long series of popular two-reel comedy shorts that were shown before feature films in theaters across the country. She was usually paired with the beautiful and witty Thelma Todd. Kelly was the brash, wisecracking tomboy, while Todd was the glamorous straight woman. And together, they created a female comedy team that rivaled any in the business. Their chemistry was genuine. They were close friends off-screen as well. When Todd died under mysterious circumstances in December 1935, found dead in her car in a garage, in what was ruled a carbon monoxide accident, but has fueled conspiracy theories ever since, Kelly was devastated and never fully recovered from the loss. She transitioned to feature films and appeared in dozens of pictures over the next several decades, including small but memorable roles in Rosemary's Baby and the original 1976 version of Freaky Friday, starring alongside Jodie Foster. But by the 1950s and 60s, Kelly had largely fallen off Hollywood's radar. She struggled with personal demons and lived in difficult financial circumstances. Then came the comeback that nobody saw coming. In 1971, Kelly was cast in the Broadway revival of the 1920s musical No, No, Nanette, produced by Busby Berkeley. Her performance brought down the house every night, and she won the Tony Award for Best Featured Actress in a Musical, a triumphant return to the spotlight at the age of 61. It was one of the great second acts in show business history. Kelly was one of the earliest openly gay performers in Hollywood, living at a time when her sexuality was generally treated as an open secret by the industry. Her close circle of friends included Tallulah Bankhead, the legendarily uninhibited actress who essentially supported Kelly financially during her lean years. Kelly died of cancer in 1981 at 71, a survivor who had outlasted the bad times and earned her curtain call. Another screen legend of the silent era rests here. Nita Naldi, one of the great femmes fatales of 1920s Hollywood. Born Mary Nona Dooley in New York City in 1894, she was of Italian and Irish descent but reinvented herself with an exotic-sounding stage name, perfect for a woman whose specialty was playing dark, dangerous seductresses on screen. Naldi was tall, striking, and had the kind of intense gaze that made audiences believe she really might devour the leading man alive. Her breakthrough came in 1922 when she was cast opposite Rudolph Valentino in Blood and Sand, playing the temptress Doña Sol, who lures the bullfighter away from his virtuous wife. The film was a sensation, and Naldi became one of the most famous women in America overnight. She followed that success with a memorable turn opposite John Barrymore in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, playing a music hall performer who falls prey to the monstrous Hyde. She was one of the defining vamp actresses of the decade, a predecessor to every dark-haired temptress who has slinked across a movie screen since. When talking pictures arrived in the late 1920s, Naldi's career faded. Not because her voice was unsuitable for the new medium, but because the vamp archetype itself had fallen out of fashion. Audiences wanted something different, and the exotic silent-era seductress gave way to a more modern kind of leading lady. Naldi appeared in a few early sound pictures but retired from the screen by 1929. She lived quietly in New York for the rest of her life, occasionally attending film festivals and retrospectives as a guest of honor, a living link to the era of Valentino and the silence. She never married. Naldi died in 1961 at 66, one of the last survivors of Hollywood's first golden age. Now let's visit a man whose name is stamped on one of the most consequential and most debated laws in American history, though few people who talk about that law know where it came from. Timothy Sullivan, known to everyone in New York politics as Big Tim, was a Tammany Hall titan who served in both the state legislature and the United States Congress. He represented the Bowery, the Lower East Side, and eventually parts of the Bronx. And he was one of the most powerful men in the city's democratic machine. But his enduring legacy has nothing to do with patronage or party politics. It rests on a single piece of legislation, the Sullivan Act of 1911. The Sullivan Act made it a criminal offense to carry a concealed weapon in the state of New York without a police-issued permit. It was one of the first major gun control laws in American history, passed at a time when street violence and gang warfare were rampant in the city's immigrant neighborhoods. The law gave police enormous discretion over who could and could not carry a weapon, a power that could be used for public safety or, less nobly, to selectively disarm political enemies while leaving friends undisturbed. Whether Sullivan's motives were genuinely reformist or cynically political has been debated for more than a century, but the law itself has endured. It remains the foundation of New York's strict firearms regulations to this day, and it has survived every constitutional challenge thrown at it, though the Supreme Court's recent decisions on gun rights have put it under new scrutiny. Sullivan himself did not live long enough to see his law's legacy unfold. He suffered from what was almost certainly tertiary syphilis, a disease that in its late stages attacks the brain and causes progressive mental deterioration. The same illness that destroyed the career of William Scanlon, the actor we'll visit shortly. By 1912, Sullivan's behavior had become so erratic that his colleagues in the legislature essentially removed him from active participation. He was placed in a sanitarium, but in September 1913, he managed to escape. Days later, his body was found on railroad tracks in the Bronx. He had been struck and killed by a freight train. The body was so badly damaged that it went unclaimed in a city morgue for nearly 2 weeks before family members identified it. He was 51 years old. It was a grim end for one of the most powerful men in New York politics, and it cast a shadow over the law that bears his name. Let us cross to another section and visit Arthur O'Connell, a character actor whose face, if not his name, was known to millions of filmgoers. O'Connell was that rarest of things, a supporting player so good he was nominated for the Academy Award twice. The first nomination came for Joshua Logan's Picnic in 1955, where he played Howard Bevins, a small-town Kansas storekeeper courting the schoolteacher played by Rosalind Russell. The performance is a masterclass in understatement, a quietly desperate man in a quietly desperate town. His second nomination came 4 years later for Otto Preminger's Anatomy of a Murder in 1959, playing Parnell McCarthy, the alcoholic legal sidekick to Jimmy Stewart's small-town lawyer. He didn't win either time, but the nominations cemented his standing as one of the finest character actors in the business. O'Connell appeared alongside Henry Fonda in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, worked in numerous television programs including The Twilight Zone and Perry Mason, and brought warmth and depth to every role he took. Born in New York in 1908, he spent his final years battling Alzheimer's disease and died in 1981 at 73. He was the kind of actor who made every movie better just by being in it. While we're visiting actors, let's pay our respects to Burt Wheeler, one half of a comedy duo that was once among the biggest draws in all of American entertainment, even though their names may draw a blank today. Wheeler and Woolsey, Burt Wheeler and Robert Woolsey, were a vaudeville and film comedy team who, in the early 1930s, were selling as many movie tickets as the Marx Brothers, and in some years more. They made a long string of hit comedies for RKO Pictures between 1929 and 1937, combining broad physical comedy with rapid-fire patter in films with titles like Diplomaniacs, Hips, Hips, Hooray, and Cockeyed Cavaliers. Wheeler was born in Paterson, New Jersey, in 1895, and came up through vaudeville, developing the boyish, romantic half of the team's dynamic. Woolsey played the fast-talking, cigar-chomping schemer, the one with the big glasses and the one-liners. Together they had a chemistry that audiences loved, a kind of anarchic energy that filled theaters during the darkest years of the Depression. Their films haven't survived in the cultural memory the way the Marx Brothers have, partly because Wheeler and Woolsey were less consistently brilliant, and partly because Woolsey's death from kidney disease in 1938 at just 49 ended the partnership before it could evolve. Wheeler attempted a solo career, appearing in nightclubs and on early television, but the magic had been in the partnership, and without Woolsey, Wheeler never recaptured the spark. He continued performing, though, right up through the 1960s, working the nightclub circuit with the professionalism of a man who had spent his entire life in show business. He died in New York in 1968 at 72, a relic of an era when two reel comedies and vaudeville gags could make a man famous across the country. Speaking of partnerships, let's talk about one of the most extraordinary deceptions in the history of American law enforcement. The story behind the film Donnie Brasco. Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano rests here at Calvary, and his is a cautionary tale about the cost of misplaced trust in a business where trust is the only currency that matters. Napolitano was a captain, a capo, in the Bonanno crime family, one of the original 5 families of the New York mafia. He was respected for his toughness and his ability to earn, and when a connected jewel thief named Donnie Brasco was brought into his orbit in the late 1970s, Napolitano did what made men did. He vouched for the newcomer, put his own reputation on the line, and brought Brasco into the family's operations. The problem was, Donnie Brasco didn't exist. The man behind the name was Joe Pistone, a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who had been living undercover inside the Bonanno family since 1976. For 6 years, Pistone ate with these men, drank with them, conducted criminal business alongside them, and recorded everything. When the operation was finally revealed in 1981, it produced more than 200 indictments and over 100 convictions. It was one of the most successful undercover operations in FBI history. For Napolitano, the revelation was a death sentence. In the mafia, the man who vouches for an informant shares the informant's guilt. Napolitano had personally guaranteed Donnie Brasco's authenticity. According to multiple accounts, Napolitano accepted his fate with a kind of grim resignation. He distributed his jewelry among friends, climbed to the roof of his building to say a final goodbye to his beloved homing pigeons, and went to a meeting from which he never returned. His body, with its hands severed, a symbolic punishment indicating he had pointed a federal agent at the family, was found in a creek on Staten Island in August 1982. He was about 51. The 1997 film Donnie Brasco, starring Johnny Depp as Pistone and Al Pacino in a role partly inspired by Napolitano, brought this grim story to millions of moviegoers. That other associate also rests here at Calvary. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was the Bonanno soldier who first befriended Donnie Brasco and brought him into the orbit of organized crime. Ruggiero was a street-level operator, not a boss, not a captain, just a working wise guy trying to earn and survive in a world that chewed up men like him every day. He took the young man he knew as Donnie under his wing, taught him the rituals and unwritten rules of mafia life, and developed what appeared to be a genuine friendship. In the 1997 film, Al Pacino's character draws heavily from Ruggiero, the aging, struggling, perpetually broke gangster who clings to his dignity even as the walls close in. When Agent Pistone's true identity was revealed, Ruggiero was arrested, convicted of racketeering and other charges, and sentenced to a long prison term. He served his time without cooperating with authorities. By the time he was released in the early 1990s, he was suffering from advanced cancer. Ruggiero died in 1994 at the age of 68. He and Sonny Black Napolitano, the man who had vouched for him, both ended their journeys here in the same Queens Cemetery, two men whose fates were sealed by the same undercover agent. Let's step away from the underworld and toward a story of genuine courage and sacrifice. Irma Lozada's grave here at Calvary honors a young woman who made history for the most heartbreaking of reasons. Born in 1959, Lozada grew up in New York and joined the Transit Police, the department that patrolled the city's sprawling subway system, in the early 1980s. On September 21, 1984, while on patrol near the Broadway Junction subway station in Brooklyn, Officer Lozada spotted a robbery suspect and gave chase on foot. The man turned and shot her. She was just 25 years old, and she became the first female police officer to die in the line of duty in New York City's history. Her death sent shockwaves through the department and the city. The Transit Police and the NYPD honored her with a funeral befitting a hero. The man who killed her was captured, convicted of murder, and sentenced to prison. Lozada's sacrifice helped change the conversation about the risks female officers face and the recognition they deserve. Her name is spoken with respect and remembrance in police precincts to this day, and she is commemorated during annual ceremonies honoring officers who have fallen in the line of duty. Another grave here honors a different kind of valor, the battlefield kind. Thomas P. Noonan Jr. was a young Marine from the Bay Ridge neighborhood of Brooklyn who gave his life in Vietnam and received the Medal of Honor for doing it. On February 5, 1969, Lance Corporal Noonan's company was engaged in a fierce firefight near the A Shau Valley, a notorious stronghold of enemy forces. When several of his fellow Marines were wounded and pinned down by heavy fire, Noonan left his own position of relative safety and ran into the open to pull them back. He made multiple trips, dragging wounded men to cover while bullets tore up the ground around him. When a grenade landed near a fallen Marine, Noonan threw himself over the man, absorbing the blast with his own body. He was killed instantly. He was 25 years old. The citation accompanying his Medal of Honor describes extraordinary bravery, the kind of selflessness that defies explanation. A young man choosing, in the span of a heartbeat, to trade his own life for someone else's. A playground in Bay Ridge was later named in Noonan's honor. He was one of more than 58,000 Americans who died in Vietnam, and one of the few whose sacrifice was recognized with the nation's highest military honor. From a young hero to one of the quieter tragedies in this cemetery, and one connected to a disaster known the world over. Eugenie Baclini was a 3-year-old girl from a Lebanese family who survived the sinking of the Titanic on April 15, 1912. Eugenie, her mother Latifa, and her infant sister Helene were all aboard the doomed vessel, part of a wave of emigration from what was then the Ottoman Empire. The 3 of them made it into a lifeboat and were rescued. They survived the most famous shipwreck in history. But just 7 months later, in November 1912, little Eugenie fell ill and died, making her the second Titanic survivor to pass away after the disaster. She was buried here at Calvary in an unmarked plot, one small grave among millions, holding a story that connects this Queens cemetery to one of the most famous tragedies of the 20th century. Let's look now at one of the more remarkable military records memorialized in this cemetery. Robert Augustus Sweeney, born in 1853, belongs to one of the most exclusive clubs in American military history. He is one of only 19 men ever to receive the Medal of Honor twice, and both of his medals were earned doing exactly the same thing, jumping into the ocean to save a drowning man. His first medal came in October 1881. Sweeney was serving aboard the USS Kearsarge in the South Atlantic when a fellow sailor fell overboard. Without hesitation, Sweeney dove into the open sea and pulled the man to safety. His second medal came just 2 years later, in December 1883, when he leaped from the USS Jamestown into the frigid waters off Hampton Roads, Virginia, to rescue yet another sailor who had gone over the side. 2 separate acts of extraordinary physical courage on the open ocean, each recognized independently with the nation's highest military decoration. What kind of man, after nearly dying once saving someone from the sea, does the exact same thing again 2 years later? The kind buried here. Sweeney served in the Navy for years and died in 1890 at just 37. The cause of his death is not recorded, but his courage is. Now let's turn to a figure from the Civil War whose youth belied his accomplishments. General Francis J. Harron rests here at Calvary, and his story is one of meteoric rise. Born in Pittsburgh in 1837, Harron moved to Iowa as a young man and was working as a banker when the Civil War erupted. He enlisted immediately, and his bravery in combat became apparent almost at once. At the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas in March 1862, Harron led his regiment into a ferocious fight, was wounded, and was captured by Confederate forces. Despite his injuries, he had rallied his men so effectively that he was awarded the Medal of Honor for the action. After being exchanged, Harron returned to service and continued to distinguish himself in the Western Theater. By the age of 25, he held the rank of Major General, making him one of the youngest men to reach that grade in the entire Union Army. He fought in campaigns along the Mississippi and in Louisiana, playing important roles in the Siege of Vicksburg and other engagements. After the war, Harron moved to Louisiana, where he practiced law, served as a United States Marshal, and participated in the difficult work of Reconstruction. He eventually returned to the Northeast and died in New York in 1902 at 64. Few soldiers of any conflict have achieved so much so fast. From one Civil War hero to another, Brigadier General Michael Corcoran, who lies in 1st Cavalry, was one of the most celebrated Irish-American figures of his era. Born in County Donegal, Ireland in 1827, Corcoran emigrated to New York and threw himself into both politics and the militia, helping organize what would become the legendary 69th New York Militia, the Fighting 69th, one of the most storied regiments in American military history. Before the war even began, Corcoran made national headlines by refusing to parade his regiment in honor of the visiting Prince of Wales, declaring he would not honor the crown of a nation that oppressed his native Ireland. He was court-martialed for the act of defiance, but when Fort Sumter was fired upon and the war began, the charges were quietly dropped. His services were needed. At the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, Corcoran was wounded and captured by Confederate forces. He spent over a year in Southern prisons, enduring harsh conditions that took a permanent toll on his health. When he was finally exchanged, he returned to New York a hero. Tragically, Corcoran died not in combat, but in a riding accident on December 22, 1863, when his horse stumbled and fell on top of him. He was just 36. The 69th Regiment he helped build went on to fight with distinction through both world wars and beyond. Let's take a walk to another section and visit a New York mayor who holds a peculiar but enduring distinction. Hugh J. Grant, buried here at Calvary, was the youngest person ever elected mayor of New York City, a record that still stands. Born in Manhattan in 1857 to parents who had immigrated from Ireland, Grant grew up in the city's Irish Catholic political world and rose quickly through the ranks of Tammany Hall. He served as sheriff of New York County before winning the mayoralty in 1888 at just 31 years of age. His administration focused on practical matters, public works, infrastructure, the expansion of city services, and was generally considered honest by the standards of Tammany-era governance, which, admittedly, was a low bar. Grant chose not to seek a second term and returned to private life, remaining active in business and democratic politics. He was a wealthy man by the time of his death in 1910 at 53. In an era when New York mayors have tended to be older and more seasoned politicians, Grant's youthful election stands as a historical curiosity, proof that in the right circumstances, ambition and the right political machine could propel a very young man to the top of the nation's largest city. And resting not far from Grant is Patrick Jerome Gleason, known as Battle Axe Gleason, who holds a distinction that can never be repeated. Gleason was the last mayor of Long Island City. Before the Great Consolidation of 1898, which merged Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx into Greater New York, Long Island City was an independent municipality with its own government, its own police force, and its own mayor. Gleason served as that mayor during the final years of the city's independent existence. He earned his colorful nickname through a combative political style that occasionally crossed the line from verbal sparring into physical confrontation. He was not above settling disputes with his fists, and his temper was legendary in Queens political circles. When the consolidation went into effect on January 1, 1898, the office of mayor of Long Island City ceased to exist forever, making Gleason the last person who will ever hold that title. It's one of those quirks of New York history that delights trivia lovers. There was a time when Long Island City had its own mayor, and the last one was a man called Battle Axe. He died in 1901 at 56. From politicians to pioneers of a different sort. Mary A. Sullivan, who rests here at Calvary, was a genuine trailblazer in American law enforcement, a woman who broke barriers at a time when the idea of a female detective was considered absurd by most of her colleagues. Sullivan joined the NYPD and rose through the ranks to become the first woman in the department's history to serve as a homicide detective. She didn't stop there. She became the first woman to reach the rank of lieutenant and the first to earn the coveted designation of first-grade detective, the highest detective grade in the entire department, a distinction that carried enormous prestige and a significant pay increase. Sullivan also had the organizational instinct to think beyond her own career. She founded the Police Women's Endowment Association, creating a mutual aid and support network for the women who would follow her onto the force. In an era when female officers were routinely dismissed, overlooked, and assigned to menial tasks, Sullivan proved that a woman could handle the most serious and dangerous cases in the city. She worked her beat for decades and died in 1950. Hundreds of officers, both men and women, attended her funeral, a measure of the respect she had earned in a profession that did not make earning it easy for a woman. Let's switch to something more lyrical. Joseph E. Howard, who rests here at Calvary, was a songwriter, performer, and showman who gave the American songbook one of its most enduring compositions. I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now. That wistful melody, written in 1909, became a massive hit and has been covered and performed countless times across the century since, by everyone from Perry Como to Henry Burr. Howard's story is pure vaudeville romance. He began performing as a child in the 1880s, reportedly singing on the streets of New York for pennies, before working his way into the theater. By the turn of the century, he was a major vaudeville star, writing and performing in popular musical comedies that toured the country. He co-wrote the words and music for numerous stage productions and individual songs, becoming one of the most prolific and successful entertainers of his generation. There's an interesting footnote to his most famous song. For decades, Howard claimed sole authorship of I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now, but Harold Orlob, a lesser-known composer, eventually filed suit, arguing that he had written the melody and Howard had merely taken credit. The courts sided with Orlob, and the 1947 biographical film about Howard, which takes its title from the song, actually depicts this controversy. Howard took the ruling in stride and continued performing well into old age. He lived to be 83, passing away in 1961, a man whose career bridged the gaslight era and the age of television. Now for one of the more tragic stories among our actors. James Murray was a handsome young leading man who starred in one of the last great silent films, King Vidor's 1928 masterpiece, The Crowd, a groundbreaking drama about an ordinary man struggling to find his footing in the anonymous vastness of New York City. Murray's performance was hailed as a revelation, natural, unforced, deeply sympathetic. Critics predicted a major career, but Murray's own life would mirror the downward spiral of his character in ways that were almost too painful to contemplate. He struggled with severe alcoholism, and his drinking made him increasingly unreliable on set. His career collapsed with terrifying speed. King Vidor reportedly sought Murray out for a role in a later film, wanting to give his former star another chance, but Murray showed up so drunk that Vidor had no choice but to turn him away. By the mid-1930s, Murray was living on the streets of New York. On July 11, 1936, his body was pulled from the Hudson River. He was 35 years old. Whether he drowned by accident or took his own life was never conclusively determined. He had gone from the leading man in one of the greatest films of the 1920s to a body in the river in less than a decade. After that heavy story, let's visit a figure from a very different era of entertainment, one whose career raises questions that are uncomfortable but important to acknowledge honestly. Tess Gardella was a stage actress and singer who performed under the name Aunt Jemima, a role and a name that carry deeply uncomfortable associations today, but were a fixture of American popular entertainment for decades. Gardella was actually of Italian descent, born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1894, and she performed the Aunt Jemima character in blackface, a practice that was widespread and widely accepted in vaudeville, on Broadway, and in early film, though it is plainly understood today as demeaning and racist. What complicates Gardella's story is the level of her success. She appeared in the original 1927 Broadway production of Showboat, one of the landmark musicals of the American theater, playing the role of Queenie alongside Helen Morgan and Jules Bledsoe. She performed extensively on radio, appeared in reviews, and was one of the most popular character performers of her era. She was so closely identified with the Aunt Jemima character that she actually filed a lawsuit against the Quaker Oats Company, arguing that her stage performances had given the Aunt Jemima brand its popular identity and that she deserved compensation for the use of the name. The case went through the courts and drew national attention. Gardella represents a chapter in American entertainment history that we can neither celebrate nor ignore. The blackface tradition she participated in caused real harm, even when performed by talented artists, and understanding that history is part of understanding America. She died in 1950 at 55. From the stage to the sculpting studio. Philip Martini, buried here at Calvary, was one of the most prolific and talented architectural sculptors of America's Gilded Age. The man whose chisels and hammers helped decorate some of the grandest buildings in the country. Born in Strasbourg, France in 1858, Martini immigrated to the United States as a young man and apprenticed under Augustus St. Gaudens, widely considered the greatest American sculptor of the 19th century. Under St. Gaudens' tutelage, Martini developed the technical skill and artistic vision that would define his career. And what a career it was! Martini created sculptural programs for the Library of Congress in Washington, one of the most ornate public buildings in America, where his work adorns the Great Hall. He designed figures for the Hall of Records in Lower Manhattan and contributed to the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch at Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, one of New York's most prominent public monuments. He also created work for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the grand fair that introduced much of America to the Beaux-Arts style. If you've ever walked past a grand old New York or Washington building and admired the allegorical figures carved above the entrance, a robed figure of justice, a winged victory, a muse of the arts, there's a reasonable chance Philip Martini created them. He worked in an era when buildings were expected to tell stories through their decoration, and Martini was one of the finest storytellers in stone. He died in 1927 at 68, and the buildings he adorned remain his legacy. Let's visit another figure whose story intertwines with the Morello crime family we encountered earlier. In fact, the man who started it all. Peter Morello, also known as Giuseppe Morello, or the Clutch Hand, a nickname that came from his deformed right hand, which was withered and claw-like from birth, is widely considered the first recognized boss of the American mafia. He arrived in New York from Corleone, Sicily, in the 1890s. Yes, the same Corleone that Francis Ford Coppola would borrow for his fictional crime dynasty, and built a criminal organization based on counterfeiting, extortion, and intimidation, operating from bases in Italian Harlem and Little Italy. Morello was the very man Joseph Petrosino spent the better part of his career investigating. The two were locked in a kind of shadow war, the detective tracking the crime boss through the tangled streets and tenements of the Italian neighborhoods. After Petrosino was assassinated in Palermo in 1909, an anonymous letter to the police named Morello as one of the conspirators behind the murder. The allegation was never proven, but the suspicion hung over Morello for the rest of his life. Morello was eventually brought down not by a murder charge, but by a counterfeiting conviction. He was sentenced to 25 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, though he served only about 10 before being released. After his release, he re-entered the criminal world in a diminished capacity, serving as an advisor to younger bosses. His luck ran out for good on August 15, 1930, when he was shot dead in his East Harlem office during what appeared to be a robbery, but was almost certainly a carefully planned hit connected to the Castellammarese War. He was 60 years old. His grave here at Calvary has reportedly become bare and neglected over the decades. No flowers, no visitors, no monument. It's a forgotten corner of the cemetery for the man who built the foundation of the American Mafia, the real-life counterpart to a fictional family that took its name from his birthplace. Another colorful underworld figure in these grounds is Kiro Terranova, whose nickname, the Artichoke King, ranks among the best in all of mafia lore. Terranova earned it by cornering the wholesale market on artichokes in New York City during the 1920s and 30s. He controlled distribution at the Bronx Terminal Market, buying up the entire supply of artichokes arriving from California and then reselling them at enormous markups. Merchants who tried to bypass his monopoly found themselves facing threats, beatings, or worse. It sounds almost comical on the surface, an artichoke racket, but the money was substantial and the operation was backed by the full weight of organized crime. The situation became so outrageous that Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia personally declared war on Terranova's vegetable empire. In December 1935, LaGuardia temporarily banned the sale of artichokes in New York City entirely, announcing at a press conference that he was determined to break what he called a criminal enterprise. The ban lasted only a few days, but it generated enormous publicity and effectively ended Terranova's stranglehold on the market. It remains one of the most unusual episodes in the history of New York City governance, a mayor going to war against a vegetable. Terranova was a member of the Morello-Terranova clan, the same extended family as Peter Morello, whom we just visited. Once feared, Terranova had been stripped of most of his power by the 1930s and died of a stroke in 1938 at 49, a diminished figure. From artichokes to a more violent end. Anthony Carfano, known as Little Augie Pisano, was a longtime figure in the Luciano crime family who had been active in organized crime since the bootlegging days of Prohibition. Born in 1898, Carfano rose through the ranks of the mob during its formative years, earning a reputation as a capable earner and a man who could be trusted with sensitive operations. He was involved in gambling, bootlegging, and various rackets in both New York and Miami, where he spent increasingly more time as he aged. By the late 1950s, Carfano was an elder statesman of the underworld, respected, well-connected, and perhaps a little too comfortable. On the evening of September 25, 1959, Carfano dined at a restaurant in Manhattan and then drove to Queens with a female companion named Janice Drake, a former beauty queen. Both were found shot dead in the back seat of his black Cadillac, parked on a quiet residential street. The double murder sent shockwaves through the underworld and was never officially solved, though it was widely attributed to Vito Genovese, who was believed to have ordered the hit as part of a broader consolidation of power within the family. Carfano was 61. It was one of the more brazen and public mob executions of the 1950s, and it served as a reminder that in the mafia, no amount of seniority guaranteed safety. Let's leave the Italian underworld behind and visit one more story from New York's rougher neighborhoods, this time from the Irish side. Somewhere in these grounds lies Mickey Spillane, and no, not the novelist who created the detective Mike Hammer. This Mickey Spillane was the boss of Hell's Kitchen, the Irish-American gangster who controlled the west side of Manhattan from the 1960s through the mid-1970s. Born in 1934 and raised in the tenements and walk-ups of that notoriously tough neighborhood, Spillane built a criminal empire based on loan sharking, gambling, and the control of union rackets along the Hudson River waterfront. What made Spillane unusual among New York's crime bosses was his neighborhood code. Unlike the Italian-American organized crime families that operated as corporate entities across the city, Spillane was territorial and personal. He was known for protecting Hell's Kitchen residents from outside criminal elements, keeping drug dealers out of the neighborhood, settling disputes, even paying for funerals. Some longtime residents genuinely regarded him as a protector, a Robin Hood of 10th Avenue. Others, of course, saw the violence and extortion that underpinned his operation. His reign ended on May 13, 1977, when he was shot and killed while walking to his car in the Woodside section of Queens, not far from where we stand now, at the age of 42. The hit was widely attributed to rivals seeking to take over his territory. The vacuum Spillane left was eventually filled by the Westies, a notoriously brutal Irish-American gang led by Jimmy Coonan, whose alliance with the Gambino crime family brought an even more violent chapter to Hell's Kitchen. Let us visit a very different sort of figure now, a painter whose ambition matched the vastness of the American West. John Mulvaney was born in Ireland around 1844 and came to the United States, where he studied art in New York and Chicago before traveling to Europe to train at the great academies. But it was the American frontier that captured his imagination. In the late 1870s, Mulvaney traveled to Montana, visited the site of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and interviewed military personnel and Native Americans who had been present at the battle. He spent years gathering details, sketching the terrain, and studying the participants before completing his masterwork around 1881. A massive canvas depicting Custer's last rally, a painting that measured roughly 11 by 20 feet. The painting toured the country and drew enormous crowds. Walt Whitman, upon viewing it in New York, reportedly declared it one of the most powerful depictions of Western conflict he had ever seen. For a time, Mulvaney was celebrated as a major American artist, but success proved fleeting. He struggled financially, suffered from what appears to have been severe depression or another mental illness, and spent periods in institutions. His later years were spent in poverty and obscurity. In 1906, his body was found in New York under circumstances that suggested drowning. Whether accidental or by his own hand was never conclusively determined. He was about 62. His great painting of Custer's Last Stand survived him and has been exhibited in various forms over the years, a reminder of an artist whose reach exceeded his fate. From one artist to another, of a very different tradition. Adolfo Müller-Urey was a Swiss-born portrait painter who became one of the most sought-after portraitists in turn-of-the-century New York and beyond. Born in 1862 in the town of Airolo, Switzerland, Müller-Urey trained at art academies in Munich and Rome before emigrating to the United States. His skill and his deep connections within Catholic ecclesiastical circles brought him commissions of extraordinary prestige. He painted Pope Leo XIII from life, a rare distinction, and created portraits of archbishops, cardinals, and other senior church officials. His secular clients were equally illustrious. He painted members of the Vanderbilt family and other figures of New York's Gilded Age high society. Müller-Urey was a devout Catholic whose faith informed both his work and his life. He created religious paintings and altarpieces for churches throughout the New York area, bringing the same care and precision to a parish commission as he did to a papal portrait. Despite the illustrious nature of his clientele, he lived modestly and devoted much of his energy to the Catholic community. He was also a noted art collector in his own right. Müller-Urey died in New York in 1947 at 85, having spent more than half a century creating a visual record of the powerful and the pious in the world's most dynamic city. Now let's visit a figure whose legacy you may encounter every time you pass a department store display case. Etienne Einer, born in Erzsébetszár in what was then Austria-Hungary in 1904, was a designer and master craftsman whose name lives on in the leather goods and fashion brand he founded. Einer learned his trade in the Old World tradition, working with leather by hand until his craftsmanship attracted a clientele that appreciated quality over mass production. He established his company in New York, designing handbags, wallets, belts, and accessories that combined European elegance with American practicality. The brand's signature, items in a deep burgundy red shade marked with a horseshoe logo, became a familiar and respected name in fashion. The Etienne Einer brand expanded internationally over the decades, and the company's products are still sold worldwide. Einer himself lived a remarkably long life, working well into old age with the same attention to detail that had defined his career from the start. He died in 2000 at 96, having outlived most of his contemporaries in the fashion industry by decades. He rests here in Calvary, a long way from his Central European birthplace, but in the city where he built his name. Let's visit Winnie Shaw, a singer and actress who had one of the most memorable musical moments in all of 1930s cinema. Born Winifred Leigh Momey in Hawaii in 1910, she was of mixed Hawaiian and American heritage, a background that was quite unusual in Golden Age Hollywood. Shaw grew up in San Francisco and made her way to New York, where she performed in nightclubs and on radio before being signed by Warner Brothers. At Warner's, she appeared in a string of lavish musicals produced during the golden age of the genre, when studios poured money into spectacle and song. Her most famous moment came in the 1935 film Gold Diggers of 1935, directed by the legendary choreographer Busby Berkeley. In the film's climactic sequence, Shaw performed Lullaby of Broadway, a Harry Warren and Al Dubin composition that won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. The number is one of Berkeley's most ambitious, a sprawling, darkly surreal production that begins with Shaw singing alone and expands into a massive dance sequence involving dozens of performers. Shaw's rich, smoky voice carries the number with effortless authority, and for many film fans, her delivery remains the definitive version of the song. Shaw appeared in several other Warner Brothers musicals and performed in nightclubs before retiring from show business in the 1940s to raise a family. She lived quietly out of the public eye for decades. Shaw died in 1982 at the age of 75. Her voice, preserved on film, continues to float through late-night classic movie broadcasts on television, a lullaby that never quite fades out. Now let's connect two threads in the tapestry of this cemetery. We visited James W. Blake earlier, the man who wrote The Sidewalks of New York. Those sidewalks were walked by millions of immigrants who came to this city with nothing but hope and the clothes on their backs. One of the men who helped them navigate their new world rests nearby. Luigi Fugazi was a banker, businessman, and community leader who arrived in New York from Italy in 1869, right at the beginning of the great wave of Italian immigration that would transform the city. He established a banking house on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village that became a lifeline for the Italian immigrant community. Through his bank, Fugazi helped tens of thousands of newly arrived Italians with the practical necessities of immigrant life, sending money back to families in the old country, purchasing steamship tickets for relatives still waiting to make the crossing, exchanging foreign currency, and navigating the bewildering American financial system. He was a trusted intermediary between a vulnerable community and a confusing new world. Beyond banking, Fugazi was a generous philanthropist and a prominent figure in Italian-American civic life, serving on boards and committees and advocating for the rights of immigrants at a time when Italians faced considerable prejudice in America. His family name continued in New York business circles for generations. Fugazi died in 1930 at the impressive age of 93, having watched the Italian community he served grow from a handful of struggling newcomers into one of the most powerful constituencies in the city. Another figure connected to the Catholic Church in New York rests here. Father Edward McGlynn, one of the most controversial priests of the 19th century and a man whose story touches on questions of religion, politics, and social justice that are still debated today. McGlynn was the pastor of St. Stephen's Church on East 28th Street in Manhattan, one of the largest and most influential parishes in the city. He was a powerful orator, a compassionate pastor, and a man of deep conviction, and those convictions put him on a collision course with the hierarchy of his own church. McGlynn became a passionate advocate for the economic theories of Henry George, the political economist whose 1879 book Progress and Poverty argued that the root of economic inequality lay in the private ownership of land. George proposed a single tax on land values as the remedy for poverty, an idea that attracted an enormous following among working-class Americans. When George ran for mayor of New York in 1886, McGlynn threw himself into the campaign with a fervor that alarmed the conservative leadership of the archdiocese. He spoke at rallies, endorsed George publicly, and used his pulpit to advocate for economic reform, all things that his superiors considered unbecoming of a Catholic priest. The archdiocese ordered him to stop. He refused. When Pope Leo XIII summoned him to Rome to explain himself, McGlynn refused that summons too, arguing that his political views were a matter of conscience, not theology. In 1887, he was excommunicated, formally cut off from the sacraments and the community of the church he had served his entire adult life. For 5 years, McGlynn lived in a kind of ecclesiastical exile, still beloved by many of his former parishioners, still speaking out on economic issues, but unable to celebrate Mass or administer the sacraments. Finally, in 1892, he agreed to present his economic theories to a papal commission, which examined his positions and concluded that they contained nothing heretical. His excommunication was lifted, and McGlynn was restored to the priesthood. He served the final years of his ministry in relative peace, dying in 1900 at 62. His story is a remarkable chapter in the ongoing tension between institutional authority and individual conscience, a tension that has played out within the Catholic Church many times before and since. Let us visit one of the more tragic and fascinating entertainment figures in these grounds. A man who was once one of the most adored performers in America. William J. Scanlon was the Justin Bieber of the 1880s, if that comparison doesn't stretch too far. A matinee idol whose voice, looks, and romantic Irish stage persona drove audiences wild. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1856, Scanlon came to New York as a young man and quickly became a star of the musical theater, appearing in a series of romantic Irish plays with titles like Shane Nalon and Mavourneen that featured songs he wrote himself, including Peekaboo and My Nellie's Blue Eyes. Women swooned. Men bought tickets because their wives and daughters insisted. At his peak, Scanlon was one of the highest-paid performers on the American stage. But in the early 1890s, something began to go terribly wrong. Scanlon's behavior became erratic and alarming. He forgot his lines, lashed out at fellow performers, and exhibited a general mental disintegration that audiences and colleagues could see happening in real time. The cause was almost certainly tertiary syphilis, the late-stage form of the disease that attacks the brain and nervous system. By 1893, Scanlon was no longer able to perform and was committed to an asylum in Bloomingdale, New York, where he spent the remaining 5 years of his life in institutional care. He died in 1898 at 42, forgotten by the fickle public that had once adored him. His rapid descent from the summit of fame to confinement and death was one of the most dramatic and public collapses of the 19th century stage. A cautionary tale about the fragility of celebrity and the cruelty of disease. Now for a brief but painful visit with James Hayden, a young actor whose career was cut devastatingly short just as it was reaching its most promising stage. Hayden appeared on Broadway in the early 1980s, a period when the New York stage was experiencing a creative renaissance, and he quickly established himself as one of the most exciting young talents in the theater. His performance in the original 1984 Broadway production of David Rabe's Hurly-Burly, a dark, frenetic drama about the drug-fueled lives of Hollywood dealmakers, drew strong notices from critics who saw in him an intensity and rawness that marked him for a major career. He had the kind of presence that fills a stage, the ability to hold an audience's attention even while surrounded by more established performers. It never got the chance to bloom. In November 1983, Hayden died of a drug overdose in New York at just 29 years old. His death was part of a broader epidemic of substance abuse that claimed numerous young artists in the early 1980s. The theater community mourned him as one of the great might-have-beens, a performer whose talent was enormous and whose future seemed limitless. He rests here at Calvary forever, 29. Continuing our walk, let us visit one of the more interesting cinematic connections in this cemetery. A link to what many consider the greatest American film ever made. The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola's 1972 masterpiece, has a direct and tangible tie to Calvary Cemetery. The funeral scene near the end of the picture, the burial of Don Vito Corleone, where the surviving family members gather amid a forest of tombstones and crosses while Michael Corleone quietly consolidates his grip on power, was filmed right here in Old Calvary. Coppola chose this location for its dramatic visual impact. The dense, crowded landscape of headstones stretching to the horizon, the urban skyline looming beyond, the sheer weight of 3 million graves pressing in from every direction. Film historians and Godfather devotees have even identified the exact location within the cemetery where the scene was staged, in Old Calvary near Section 1W. If you've seen the film, and who among us hasn't, you've already seen this cemetery, even if you didn't know it at the time. The fictional Don Corleone is not actually buried here, of course, but there is a genuine Godfather connection resting in these grounds. Joseph Medaglia, a real Franciscan priest, appeared in the film as Father Carmelo, the priest who administers the sacrament of baptism in the iconic christening scene. That sequence, the solemn ritual of a Catholic baptism cross-cut with a series of savage assassinations ordered by Michael Corleone, is one of the most celebrated and imitated sequences in the history of cinema. The sacred and the profane woven together in a way that defined an era of filmmaking. Father Medaglia, a real man of God playing a man of God, brings an authenticity to the baptismal rite that a professional actor might not have achieved. He died in 1993 and rests here at Calvary. So this cemetery is both a filming location for The Godfather and the final home of one of its performers, a double connection to one of the great American films. From Hollywood fiction back to New York reality, John Fox served as a United States representative from New York and was one of the many Irish-American politicians who shaped the city's governance in the tumultuous decades after the Civil War. Born in Ireland in 1835, Fox emigrated to America as a boy and settled in New York, where he went to work and eventually entered politics through the Democratic Party organization. He served as an alderman on the New York City Council before winning election to Congress, where he represented a Manhattan district from 1867 to 1871. Fox's time in Congress coincided with the Reconstruction era, one of the most contentious periods in American political history, and he represented a constituency that was overwhelmingly composed of immigrants and their children, people who had their own fierce battles to fight for economic survival and political representation. After leaving Congress, Fox returned to New York City and remained active in business and democratic politics for the rest of his life. He was part of the generation that laid the foundation for the great Irish-American political machine, preparing the ground for figures like Al Smith and the Wagner family who would follow. Fox died in 1914 at 79, having witnessed the transformation of Irish Americans from despised newcomers to a dominant force in the city's political life. Now let's visit a remarkable woman whose contribution to the story of Irish New York deserves to be far better known than it is. Anna Frances Levins was a photographer, publisher, and activist born in New York in 1876, at a time when Irish Americans were still fighting to establish themselves in the social and economic hierarchy of the city. Levins founded and edited the Irish American Advocate, a newspaper that served as a voice for the Irish American community during a turbulent period in both Irish and American history, spanning the years of the Irish independence movement, the Easter Rising of 1916, and the establishment of the Irish Free State. But Levins was more than just a newspaper editor. She was also an accomplished photographer who documented the daily life, the celebrations, the hardships, and the culture of the Irish neighborhoods of New York, creating a visual record of a community that was rapidly changing as immigrants assimilated, and their American-born children moved outward to the outer boroughs and suburbs. Her photographs capture a world that was already beginning to fade. The tenement blocks, the parish churches, the neighborhood gatherings, the faces of people who had crossed an ocean and built new lives from nothing. Levins was deeply committed to the cause of Irish independence and used her newspaper to advocate relentlessly for a free Ireland. She died in 1941 at 65, leaving behind both written and photographic archives of considerable historical value. And now, for our final stop, let's go back to the very beginning. Because the first person ever buried at Calvary Cemetery, the very first of those 3 million souls, rests here somewhere in First Calvary. Her name was Esther Ennis, and she was a washerwoman. On July 31, 1848, just weeks after the cemetery was formally consecrated by Archbishop John Hughes, Esther became its inaugural burial. According to the cemetery's records, she died of a broken heart. That's all we know about Esther Ennis. We don't know where she was born, though in 1848 the odds are good she came from Ireland, since the Great Famine was driving hundreds of thousands of desperate Irish men and women across the Atlantic to New York. We don't know how old she was, or who she loved, or what broke her heart so completely that the person who recorded her passing used that phrase to explain it. Maybe she lost a husband or a child, or the country she'd left behind. Maybe the hardships of immigrant life in a crowded, indifferent city simply overwhelmed her. We'll never know. The record gives us her name, her occupation, and the poetry of her cause of death, and nothing more. But she was here first, before the 4-time governor and the 20 Grammy singer, before the detective who drew 200,000 mourners and the mob boss who was shot over lunch, before the baseball Hall of Famers and the comedy legends and the silent film stars and the Tammany bosses, before Tony Bennett's family laid their Queensboy to rest in the modest Benedetto plot, before Annie Moore's Celtic cross was imported from Ireland, Before the Fighting 69th's general and the Medal of Honor recipients and the speakeasy queen and Mozart's librettist, before all 3 million of them, there was a washerwoman named Esther Ennis who died of a broken heart and was laid to rest in a new Catholic cemetery in Queens. She opened the door, and the rest of New York followed her through it, one by one. For the next 178 years, they're still coming. That brings our walk through Calvary Cemetery to a close. 365 acres, 3 million stories, and we have only just scratched the surface. The graves we visited today represent the famous, the infamous, the heroic, and the forgotten, but they are a fraction of the lives contained within these grounds. Every headstone here marks a life that mattered to someone. Thank you for joining us among the headstones of Queens. Until next time.